Hi, I'm Paul. Congratulations on reaching this far. Good luck to both teams.
Hey, I'm Sagat. Congratulations on breaking. Best luck.
Hi, I'm Wesley. Congratulations on making it this far. All the best for the finals.
All right, thank you. I think we're still waiting for the teams to take their speaking order, and after that, we can formally begin with the debate. All right, thank you. Uh, Without further ado, just some housekeeping rules. Of course, keep yourselves muted while the other speaker is speaking until and unless the PY preferences have been stated otherwise. Speaking of which, at the start of your speech, please do communicate your preferred gender pronouns and your preferred method of taking POIs, be it through text or verbally. All right, then. I'm not going to read the info slide. On the motion that this house, as the journalist, would continue to keep his identity a secret, may we please have proposition one. Here.
Am I visible to everybody and audible?
Yes, you're both visible and audible.
Perfect. So before I begin my speech, the Gyatistan delegation just wants to thank the tournament organizers and judges for an amazing tournament. I would prefer verbal POIs and I have no pronoun preference. My time will begin in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to do a couple of different things in this speech. First of all, I'm going to begin with a model and some characterization of firstly what the journalist looks like before looking at the war criminal and moving on to talk about some further characterization points. Then I'm going to move on to two substantives. Firstly, on how the journalist is on how the war criminal is most likely coerced into joining the war, and secondly, on how this is going to most likely do worse things to the community and just become worse overall on reciprocity. And actually, I'm going to run a third argument then on how you get insider information from this war criminal. First of all, then, on the model and characterization, on the journalist, I think this journalist is very likely to have very strong moral perspectives and an affinity for different people's viewpoints and perspectives. This is because as a journalist, you want to change the world and bring truth to the world, thereby making it a better place, such as by stopping oppression or corruption. The second mechanism under this is that journalists have a bunch of empathy because they have to write compelling stories about other people. And the only way they can write these compelling stories is by stepping into the shoes of the other person. Therefore, this means it's most likely the journalist who has a higher capacity for empathy towards other people. And what this really looks like is balanced reporting because you need to present multiple perspectives on an issue. This looks like journalists needing a very high standard of cultural competence to accurately report on these cultural issues. The last thing under this characterization of the journalist then is that journalists need to have very high ethical standards and codes of conduct, which emphasize things like truthfulness, fairness, and transparency. They probably care significantly about these things and these ethical principles, thereby meaning that they're most likely going to care about whether this war criminal dies or not. Second characterization I want to make then is on the war criminal themselves, because I think the motion is quite vague about the war criminal, but it is most likely that they're not the biggest actor in the war. It's very probable it's not going to be a very groundbreaking or newsworthy story, such as, oh, Hitler is still alive in Argentina. It's very likely to be some random guy who was involved in working the gas chambers. This looks like that 80-year-old guy who got on the news a couple of weeks ago. He was on the news because he worked in Auschwitz and now has to serve time in prison for his crimes. By chance, there are millions of war criminals out there. The likelihood that this is some very, very big, no thank you war criminal, a very famous leader, is going to be very, very insignificant. I don't think it's very likely that this will be a person who is very high up in the chain of command. But second mechanism for this, though, is that if he was undercover for so long, this war criminal is presumably going to be someone who is not very significant in the first place because he was able to stay undetected for so long. If someone such as Goebbels was able to stay alive in Argentina for an extended period of time, it's very, very likely he would have been found out within a couple of years after moving there, and therefore someone who is very significant would be found out very quickly. Therefore, it is very likely that this person is very insignificant in the grand scheme of things. Last thing on this then is there's a couple of reasons why this is not worth for the journalist to take this war criminal's presumptions. It probably happened very long ago in the past, meaning that people and victims affected have long moved past and probably have already died. Because if we're talking about World War I, World War II, huge atrocities occurring then, most of these people are 100 and something years old now. It's very likely that they've already moved on or died. That means their families are the only people who are affected, or the people today who were actually born far after this happened. Lastly, then, are on the governments, because the governments involved have moved past this as well. Largely, we think that the world has moved on from these events. We think this is very important for a couple of reasons. And largely, we think this is very important because of the nexus of change. The nexus of change of this debate is not going to be one on the practical, because on both sides, the only difference between our side and their side is that on their side, this war criminal is going to be killed, they're going to be executed. But the reason for this is that literally nothing is going to happen otherwise, right? There's very marginal utility to the journalist if they leak it to the world, right? If they try to kill this guy. Because this happened so long ago, there's very likely to be few practical benefits to this journalist because nobody cares about it anymore. I think that the journalist is very unlikely to enjoy any benefits because this person is so insignificant. Okay, on to my first substantive argument then on how this war criminal is most likely coerced into joining the war. I already gave you analysis on why the journalist cares about whether this person was coerced into joining the war, but I'm going to give you more analysis on why this actually matters to the journalist. First of all, you have pressures such as patriotism, a need for money. People don't join wars just because they like killing people. They join wars because of necessity, because they have to. But secondly, there's moral relativism. Because if you're born in Nazi Germany and are forced to grow up, you're forced to grow up indoctrinated, because you're indoctrinated from birth, from the propaganda from people like Joseph Goebbels. These are the people who are going to propagandize everything that happens and force you into the war because of that idea of, oh, we are the superior nations. What we are doing is correct. So that means if you're going and working the gas chambers, it's most likely because you were forced into that because of that indoctrination from birth. I think overall what this means is that you are most likely acting out of necessity, not at this time, rather than something like, oh, I want to do this. As a war criminal, the fact that you're helping out a community after, I think speaks that testament of whether or not you are actually wanting to do those things. This is most likely a chance for you to rehabilitate yourself and restore justice. I'll take that POI.
So because you argue that all Nazis were sort of coerced into joining, so are Nazis forgiven?
I didn't say that. What I said is that this is most likely to be a very insignificant individual. This very insignificant individual probably grew up on this indoctrination and propaganda. This means that they probably grew up in a world where they look at people and they say, I am superior than you because I have blue eyes and blonde hair. They're not going to be someone like Goebbels, like Hitler, who most likely don't believe in what they're doing. They just want to do it so they can have power. Those people are culpable because they institute those policies. This person is a cog in the machine, just a person in the system. We don't think that POI stands. On to my second point then on reciprocity. On further characterization of the journalists, they're very likely to be logical and impartial in thinking about these present effects on people. Because they're expected to report things very objectively without bias or favoritism, this means they need to have very strong moral principles and an affinity for these very diverse viewpoints so that they can maintain impartiality in their reporting. I think that it's most likely that the journalist is going to weigh this out very clearly, because it's most likely that they're going to let this person like atone for their past mistakes by helping out their community in the present, which makes the principled harm much lesser on our side of the house. Because even if he committed war crimes, we would much rather have a world where he's actively making up for committing these war crimes rather than the world where he dies. This is a very simple question of how many people he's benefiting afterwards. And this question of utility is very simple because it is the question of present utility, which is more important than righting these past wrongs, which no longer are cared about by the generations of people that came before. I would much rather let this war criminal redeem himself, because it isn't about righting the wrong, but how he can maximize the happiness that is currently happening, how he can move forward and give like some sort of restorative justice to the victims. Just because you kill him doesn't mean you give justice to anybody else. The best way to actually get justice is to make him contribute to society. Therefore, to the journalist, I think nothing actually changes because you aren't undoing any atrocities or doing anything for the victims. The only thing suggested is that this person will be executed. On utility, nothing is improved on opposition. And because this journalist is going to look at this very objectively, they will weigh the options for the community and say that, oh, this is much better a situation. I think this new community is going to be robbed of a helpful member under opposition side of the house, which is a huge impact on present utility. Last argument I want to forward then is on insider information, because as a journalist, you often have a passion for like history and stuff like that, but they can definitely tell you what happened, for example, during the conflict. You're going to get out of this person very interesting testimonies, news stories. This means that you get very, very important impacts out of this because they can tell you stuff that nobody knows. They can fill in the gaps for you. They can tell you what it's like literally to be a person working those gas chambers and what the moral shame they feel after is. Those are stories that are indispensable and are often very hard to take back. That means that for the journalist, this is a very unique, because And typically, a company like the New York Times can take the spotlight if there's a single exposure article. No, it's protected. But the company relies on you, and you have leverage if you entered a continued relationship with the criminal for these more stories and testimonies. But now you are the only connection and therefore are indispensable to the company. We forwarded several characterizations of the journalists and the war criminals, and we told you why this journalist cares about all these issues. Because this war criminal should not be held culpable, we're very proud to propose.
Thank you, Proposition 1, for that fine speech. To introduce the case from the opposition bench, may we please have Opposition 1.
Am I clearly seen and audible?
Yes, you can be clearly seen and you're audible.
Excellent. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. Side proposition spends a lot of time characterizing. Unfortunately for them, they do it very poorly, because I think they have chosen convenience over realism in the way in which they characterize what this journalist looks like and what these war criminals look like. 2 arguments from side opposition. First, on whether the moral weight of the secret is something this journalist will never be able to live with. And secondly, on whether the massive recognition you receive, unlike what proposition assumes, is going to make your life significantly tangibly better. Before that, I want to remind the panel that this is still an actor motion. So we don't care what morally correct is of this journalist. So responses then. In fact, 6 responses, or 5 responses. Number 1, they say that this is going to be a journalist who has strong moral perspectives and empathy. I agree. But what they miss, though, is that the way you construct empathy is through your own lived experiences, right? I'm going to analyze later why this journalist is more likely to feel empathy towards the victims of this war criminal, to the atrocities committed, as opposed to empathy towards this war criminal or the community they serve. But secondly, and this is very, very important, the assumption from their side is that this is going to be a random guy, right? I don't think a random guy, a very low-level Nazi, Nazi like janitor or something for a concentration camp, something like that, right? I have 3 responses. Number 1, long forgotten is written in the info slide. For you to be forgotten, you need to be remembered at the very first place. Nobody remembers some random gas chamber worker in the Nazi concentration camps. People remember the head organizer or like the head commander who runs the camp, right? Just by semantics itself, their characterization is false. But secondly, notice that they are operating on a binary, right? War criminals exist on a spectrum. It's not just Hitler and a low-level infantry. There are intermediates, generals, who weren't like the most popular, but are well-known within the country in which they committed the atrocity, or at least within the municipality in which they committed a war crime, for example. So I don't think that this binary they push onto us is really fair. But thirdly, notice the info site says they're likely to be executed, right? If they're that bad that they demand execution, they probably did something really, really terrible, or at least were like a high-level worker. Because guess what? There were millions of Nazi soldiers. You didn't have millions of executions in Nazi Germany for the Nuremberg trials, which means then that this person is probably very important, or at least has done some really, really insidious things that go beyond just, I was following orders. But then they say they were probably acting out of necessity. I don't think that's true. Because panel, doing war is different from doing war crime. Shooting another soldier in an act of war is just war. Shooting a civilian, raping women, torturing people for information, that is a war crime. Understand the distinction. Finally, they say that this journalist is going to care about utility, and the best utility is, and the best form of utility and justice is when, society is a better place. I don't know what kind of human being this journalist is, panel, but the vast majority of people think thing coming to you. As simple as that. Unless you're able to mechanize the likelihood of this journalist thinking like a liberal debater like us, I don't think that's likely to be the case. But then they say that this person is going to be a valuable member of the society. I have 2 responses. 1, the point in time we expose this person and talk about the fact that this village in, I don't know, Switzerland Argentina, let's say, house this journalist, this village comes into attention, which means you're going to get lots of media there, lots of people going there to visit where he lived, so on and so forth, which injects economic benefit to this particular locality. So I would argue that in our side, these communities far better off. But more importantly, the systems have been built. Let's say this war criminal built like democracy or like built like a school. The school is already built. And notice this person is probably old anyway. They're going to die in a few years soon. So they're probably not an irreplaceable part of the community. So that impact is out of the debate already. I have pretty much rebutted every single part of proposition's case. Second proposition, good luck. Firstly, let's talk about the moral weight of this secret. 2 reasons as to why you can't live with this as a journalist. Number one, because you have a personal connection to the crimes committed. By the way, POIs verbally. Why is this the case? Because you probably won't stumble across this journalist willy-nilly, right? You probably recognize them, and a lot of people recognize them, right? But they've disappeared. It means that they've hid themselves pretty well. Maybe they used to be a Nazi German commander. They now live in some obscure village in Argentina. The only way you're probably going to discover them is not by walking into a bar in London. You're probably going to discover you're probably going to be reading up on this case because it interests you. You discover some hidden and subtle clue and you follow this lead, right? What does this then mean? You were reading up on this issue. You read up on the atrocities, the number of people he killed. You went to the families of those who were murdered and assaulted. You talk to the families, you visit the graves with mothers who had to bury their children and mothers who don't know where the children are buried because a lot of them graves were never discovered. You see the grief behind the eyes. You know that they'll never be able to live again, never be able to overcome the grief they have suffered. You'll actually therefore develop a very strong emotional connection with this war criminal, with the crimes he has committed. And like to have a strong passion towards bringing this to justice. So before I move on to my second point, sure.
These people are long dead. Their families stopped caring a long time ago. Please reconcile.
I don't think so. If I had a child who was taken away from me, I will never be able to live again. Guess what? Just look up how the families of people who have suffered war crimes react. Maybe some of them have moved on, but most won't, because guess what? Those who you love never truly leave you. Secondly, even if this is not the case, even if you accidentally stumbled onto this, who are you? You are a journalist, right? Your fundamental mission in life is probably the pursuit of truth. It is very unlikely you're a materialistic person. Because guess what? Journalism doesn't pay well. I work for a news organization. I get paid less than minimum wage, right? You probably have enough money to maybe afford afford a rent and afford decent living, but you don't have a very materialistic life. The reason you're still doing it and don't, for example, go into investment banking is because you're passionate about the truth. It matters to you. But more importantly, passionate about uncovering truth that makes a difference. In our side of the house, you get to make a difference by telling these families where their children are buried, finding the mass graves that are unmarked for centuries, uncovering this information. But more importantly, hearing thanks from the family who had never known the murderer of their child that was still alive, who can finally see this monster being brought to justice. We think that uniquely matters. Journalistic integrity is something you as a journalist care about, because you not only is it a fundamental part of you, but because you interact with journalists all your life, it has been instilled into you as a virtue you will never be able to get rid of. On their side, this journalism can never live a life that is guilt-free. He will never be able to have a good life. Secondly, then, let's talk about recognition. And I reject the premise, not taken, that you won't get recognition. Once again, I characterize this person is probably not going to be the complete unknown. But more importantly, just because something isn't talked about right now doesn't mean it cannot get popular. I am pretty sure most of the people didn't know about the Watergate scandal, but when that op-ed came out, people were interested. People were now looking up to this journalist, right? What happens in our side? You're brought to the limelight as a hero. You're seen as the person who has brought this monster to justice, who has pillaged villages, who has murdered innocent men, children, and women, right? You're essentially going to become huge. Even if you're not in the Times magazine, you become the local hero of the country. You're well beyond the time, right? Why is being this famous really, really good? One, it's good for your career, right? You're now the face of the organization you work for. Let's say if you work for the New York Times, you're not going to become one of those prominent journalists of the recent New York Times generation, but you're also going to get things like raises. You're going to get all the best articles and the best stories. You're going to have your career secure forever because you're never going to lose a job because you wrote the scoop of the century. But secondly, you're going to get massive amounts of validation from the families who thank you for figuring out where the unmarked graves are, who can finally go and pay respect to the loved ones whom they have lost and never could go back to. But more importantly, people recognize you. Your peers who you want validation from, other journalists recognize you, your elders, the mentors say, I am proud of you. All of these things matter to you. Ultimately, this is an actor motion, and it's in the best interest of this actor to not live with this secret that is going to haunt them forever. I have never
Proposition 1 for that fine speech. To continue the case from the proposition bench, maybe please have proposition second speaker here.
All right, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
All right, thank you. I'll take POIs in chat, please. Leader of opposition has very bad time management because they spend a lot of time explaining why this journalist does have a care for truth. But let me ask you, what exactly is the truth in the situation? If you execute him and people will only look at his war crimes, but not the good that he is all the good that he has done for his own community and all the attempts that he has made in order to make up, in order to actually ask for forgiveness for those past war crimes. All that will be forgotten the moment he is executed, the moment you expose him, the moment you release his identity, the moment you taint his new identity as his former identity, the former identity that he always wanted to leave and is currently in the process of leaving, except you're the one that is inherently preventing him from reaching that forgiveness. Ultimately, I think if side opposition wants to talk about truth, the truth is best left on our side, where there is no public media pressure trying to turn this into some major story, trying to twist the truth into something it's not. And for all those reasons, we're incredibly proud to propose. There's three things I'll go into my speech. Firstly, I'll talk about the principle and why you think this is principally justified. Secondly, I'll talk about the practical and why we're winning on the practical and why this is unlikely going to bring you the sort of fame and money the opposition would like to characterize. Firstly, on the principle. So basically, the only sort of principled claim we hear from side op is basically that the journalist, is very empathetic and he sees the stories of these victims. But I would note, this is symmetric, right? If the journalist is reading all these stories about victims, the journalist is also likely reading, many stories about soldiers who had to go through pain, soldiers who were probably indoctrinated, soldiers who had to act out of necessity in their situations. No, thank you. But secondly, I'm not sure what difference you're making when you kill this person. Are the victims, suddenly going to feel much happier about themselves now that you've killed this guy? Of course not. The guy's long forgotten, right? The victims are probably already long dead. So I'm not sure what sort of principled difference that you as a journalist believe you're making when you execute this person. Comparatively, our principle is much stronger because our principle actually applies to someone who is living, someone who can actually remember someone who actually has morals, someone who can actually register this principle. So what do we tell you in terms of our principle? Number one, he was likely coerced into war, that he was indoctrinated into patriotism, that for millions of people all across the world, they acted out of necessity in order to make a living for their family. I think as a journalist, you're likely going to respect that. But secondly, I think it's when you let this person survive, he is much more likely going to bring about restorative justice to these victims. Why? Because the guy is literally contributing, doing good things for his community, right? He's trying to make up for his past war crime. So if the problem for you as a journalist, PLIs in chat, if the problem for you as a journalist was somehow that, this person is doing very, very bad things, the solution is not to just kill him off and no one's actually helped. The solution is to get him to contribute to his community in other ways in order to solve for his past mistakes. I think we get a much better principle on our side of the house that we characterize. All right, before I go on, I'll take the POI.
Do you empathize more with your family or a starving child on the street?
Could you repeat that?
Do you
repeat that?
more empathy towards your family members than you do some random stranger?
I'm not sure how that's relevant to the debate, but what I would say is the journalist likely has immense empathy for a soldier who needed to fight, not only because he was pressured to do so by a corrupt government, but also a soldier who likely did so because his family was starving during the Great Depression. All right. In terms of bringing about fame and money towards this journalist, I think Elo thinks he gives a lot of responses to like our argument, but all the responses are just terrible and like one-liners, right? Like, firstly, if they're long thought to be dead, they're likely so insignificant that no one looked further into it. But secondly, like Elo also says like, well, if he's executed, that means he's important. Like, no, low status doesn't exempt you from execution either. So honestly, I have like no idea what all these responses from Elo is talking about. All right, we gave you a much clearer argument when we told you that this was unlikely going to bring the frame that opposition was talking about for a variety of reasons. By probability, the guy is likely insignificant. There are millions of soldiers, there is only a few captains. Secondly, if he was able to stay undercover, that means there was less scrutiny on this person, which means he was likely insignificant in the first place. But thirdly, as we already said, the war was like a really long time ago, okay? Like, if you suddenly just report on a war that no one even remembers what happened, like no one even remembers, what century it was in, I'm not sure that's going to gain a lot of traction. But even if we take them at their best and assume that this is a big story, why is it that they're still losing? For three reasons. Firstly, the publisher is likely going to take credit, not you, given that the publisher, your publisher, has immense amount of power over you, given that they're the ones controlling all the articles that you release. Secondly, even if you do somehow manage to take credit for that one article, there's going to be immediately 5 other copycat articles that are going to dilute your fame from other publishers as well. But thirdly, I think LO contradicts his own argument, right? When he says like, oh, as a journalist, the reason why you didn't become an investment banker or a businessman is because you care about the truth and not fame or money, right? So if their second argument is that like the journalist cares about fame or money, that's literally a direct contradiction. All right, what was the better argument that we explained to you from first that went completely unengaged with from LO? What we explained was that there was necessary insider information that you as a journalist could gain simply by keeping close contacts and keeping this person alive first and foremost and maintaining good relations with this person. Now, why do you care about this? I think as a journalist, you likely need a consistent source of stories, but you're also likely very passionate about history, for example. So you want to, this is like your area, this is your field, right? You're basically really passionate about researching into the past and researching history. I think to the point at which on our side of the house, you're able to maintain basically, primary source directly from the past. This is valuable to you in a variety of ways, right? Firstly, you're able to get new stories that you would have never possibly thought of on their side of the house because it would have only possibly originated from someone who had actually experienced that story before. You're able to use these stories and make documentaries about them. You're able to portray your articles in a way that, people haven't experienced before. That's only possible on our side of the house. But secondly, there's significantly more likely chance that you're going to make a breakthrough in terms of your journalism. That is to say, this person can tell you which spots to look, who to ask, who is relevant during that period in time, right? I think as a journalist, this makes your work significantly easier, right? Instead of having to research, for hours about the historical past and like what people were thinking, what was important. Now you just have this primary source that can literally tell you what was important, tell you what they did in the past, for example, and it makes your life significantly easier. And I would just like to note, this is a journalist. There are significant amounts of pressure on the publisher to publish, a consistent amount of articles every single week. If you're able to get this person to make your life that much easier, that means more time for your other passion projects. That means you actually, have a good experience out there in the field instead of just staring at your computer researching all day. I think that's a massive benefit on our side. So ultimately, there was no reason to kill a guy that had already changed his mind, that had already asked for forgiveness. On the other hand, we ask that you keep this person in order to keep him as an incredible source of information. For all those reasons, proud to propose.
Thank you, Proposition 2, for that fine speech. To continue the case from the opposition bench, maybe please have Opposition 2.
POIs in chat. 3, 2, 1. Today is a wild day, but I almost fell off my chair when Second Prop thought it was a good idea to open their speech by saying they were the team that preserved truth. Because our claim was simple. If this war criminal has repented and is so good, then we can leave this up to the criminal justice system to decide and include this as a mitigating factor for whether they want to execute him, prosecute him, or let him remain within the community. But what we explained was very simple. If the state is willing to bypass a fair criminal justice process when prosecuting this war criminal, what does that suggest about the scale of his actions? We explained from Rubaya that there are millions of Nazis, but we don't execute every single Nazi. We only save that form of punishment for those that are the most evil in history. If the state chose to execute someone who's already classified as a war criminal, that suggests he's no ordinary layman who just picked up a gun because he had to. He played a large role in that conflict, and we ought to clarify why he did so and what happened to him. The first thing I want to do in this speech is break their claim that this guy is not culpable. He holds less moral evil because World War II was a long time ago. The guy is old. There might be moral relativism. That is disgusting. One, you as the journalist know that you don't get to unilaterally decide this because we don't have guaranteed access to his precise lived experiences. We don't know for sure that he was coerced to do this. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. But what we do know is we don't know whether families still care or they don't care. The best thing we can do is give them this information so they can decide for themselves. Two, this is just an empirically untrue moral framework. We still pay reparations for atrocities in World War II. We're still fighting to demand apologies for comfort women in World War II. We still ban the swastika in many countries because of World War II. The victims may have died, but their families suffered from intergenerational trauma. So if society has moved on from Nazi Germany, even if this happens, you are someone who's proximate to this because you've been researching it for such a long time that it seeps into your morals. But third, is coercion actually a precondition for you forgiving this person? They never analyze why this is true. Like, their claim is that the family is under the Great Depression. They lived under a dictatorship. One, we don't know this. Two, you can bring up as a justification. Three, if this is something that's really true for this guy, then why are we still prosecuting many people who have committed war crimes in the past? So they have a lot of work to do in third, but if they want to stick with this principle, we can let the panel decide if they find this persuasive. Three issues. One, social utility. Two, journalistic integrity. Third, personal recognition. First, on social utility. So their claim is that we don't actually care about social utility, as First Prop says, but if you notice, all their argumentation is dependent on proving that they get social utility from this guy being alive. Because otherwise, their claim of not intervening is because intervening creates less utility. So that means they believe that utility is an important metric in the debate. Why do we win this? One, if this guy introduces democracy or Wi-Fi access to a rural community, like, these structures still exist. It's probably the case that this guy laid the foundation for things to happen, and his active presence is not needed for the community. Why? Because as First Prop says, he's old. He's going to die soon. So on either side, he's probably not going to be there for very long. So the delta probably is, at least we can get this guy into justice because of all the things he's committed. But number two, because of how monumental this discovery is, and as they say, the publisher is going to claim credit, many people are going to create copycat articles, this revelation brings this community out into the public eye where previously they weren't. Why is this the case? Because this is an isolated community, because it's like, as we say, if it's London, guy probably won't live there, he'll probably be caught. So this is probably a far-off community, and previously they didn't have access towards good things. So now at least we're able to bring this out into the limelight. The state and people who can see that these people are suffering, we can provide them with aid because there's lots of airtime to show these people as being someone that we need to care about. Third, let's say you don't believe this. This is a far-off community where he decided, hey, this is a good hiding spot. In the worst case, it probably isn't a very populous area. It's a very small group of people compared to the thousands of people who face injustice from war crimes, and you are going to conceal that under your side. Okay, why is this important? Because at the end of the day, it still says they may be executed. But one, why should we impose our own version of vigilante justice rather than leave it up to actual criminal justice systems? Again, you are a singular person in the justice system. You know your place as a journalist because you have to be well read up on things in order for you to make good articles. You know it's best for you to not intervene, or even if it's better, it's just not your place. Two, if it's true that the courts aren't even willing to give him a chance to defend himself, probably means there's societal consensus that he is very evil. And so even if he was, oh, maybe I was a little bit coerced into it, it's still something we need to care about. Two, journalistic and moral integrity. We explained from first op that the moral weight of keeping this secret will burden you for the rest of your life. And why is it that, let's assume this moral weight doesn't exist, why journalistic integrity of you reporting on things that are true rather than turning a blind eye to it is something you care about? The reason for this is that the actor probably has an express preference for these journalistic values. 3 reasons. 1, you are probably a smart guy, but you decided to dedicate yourself to the field of journalism as opposed to other fields which will be more financially lucrative. So this probably shows that you have some level of affinity for what journalism represents in society. So you want to make sure that you are aligned with those values rather than trying to escape them. 2, you interact with other journalists on a daily basis because they are part of your organization. So you internalize these norms. But thirdly, even if you don't personally feel like you need to care about journalistic integrity, you always run the risk of one day someone finds out. And what if you are the one that are going to be seen in the future as being like morally complicit in this? Or what if someone else gets all the fame and the money and you regret this and say, it could have been me instead? So even if you don't care about this, you still have to act right now because the comparative is worse. Next thing I'm going to answer is why you have a positive moral obligation rather than a negative moral obligation to like not intervene. So which one weighs up more? We explain that a positive moral obligation is more important because it's part of what you do as a journalist, and you maintaining that negative moral obligation, even if it's more important, is going to be bad for you. And the point where the utility of this moral decision weighing down on you for the rest of your life probably isn't a good thing. Before that point,
the average person only cares about news with directly proximate impacts, such as the Russia-Ukraine war or rising inflation. Why will your story have such a huge impact? It resonates the world over and gives you massive benefits.
Because they think that he's long dead war criminal, and they explain that they may be executed if they were found extradited. And if, for example, if Hitler is found out to still be alive tomorrow, or even if he's already dead, but he was cosplaying as Michael Jackson or something, probably people will understand that that's a bad thing. And then the fact that this person has been able to conceal his identity for a long time probably has some virality to it, and people value this. Okay, third argument on personal recognition. Historians will consult you for future documentaries or BBC interviews, especially since this evidence is indisputable. People will praise your skill. Even if it's not for the monetary compensation of this, the fact that you can be finally recognized as a journalist in such a competitive field is what brings you some level of solace. How do they respond? 2 things. They say you can have a working relationship with him, so you can hear grandfather stories from World War II. 1, why will he divulge that info to you? What's in it for him? Because he knows that the moment he tells you this, you will report to the media. So people will question, what's your source? Who told you this? Is there written evidence of this? People will demand to know, and he will be exposed, so he won't agree to give you this information. 2, if we prosecute and execute him, we can still extract that info from him. Like if the state wants to torture him to get info from him, fine, that's not my place to decide whether it's just or not, but we can still extract this info from his beneficiaries, from other people in the community. So if it's such a good guy, we can still get the other people in his community to tell us the story. Finally, their side says the publisher will claim credit and there'll be copycat articles. Unclear why this is something that's going to stop you from still receiving some basic level of recognition. You are a guy who's exposed a historical truth that's remained hidden for so long. For these reasons, oppose.
Thank you, Opposition 2, for that point speech. Now, to conclude the constructive part of the case from the Proposition bench, may we please have Proposition's third speaker here. Proposition 3, the floor is yours.
Yeah, sorry. I realized I was muted this whole time. Am I audible now?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay. Am I visible?
Yes, you're visible as well.
Thank you. Speech begins in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. What opposition fails to consider is that all journalists have a purpose. They are journalists for a reason, and they have certain goals and objectives. They want to make the world a better place. They want to uncover big stories. They want to become famous, and yes, all of these things are true. But the fact of the matter is, they fail to consider what is actually most important to these people as humans as well. And for that reason, I'm so proud to propose a couple of things in my speech then. Firstly, I'm going to really be extremely clear on what your true incentives as a journalist are and what you care about. Then I'm going to get into 3 different things. Firstly, who gets the best for this journalist's moral conscience? Secondly, who gets better fame and repute for this journalist? And then thirdly, why our comparative is just so much better than what is suggested by opposition. So to begin, what do you actually care about as a journalist? There's 2 things. Firstly, fame and money and a platform to be able to tell your stories and to be able to propagate your values, etc., etc. Yes, we agree that this is true. Opposition agrees that this is true. Let's move on. Secondly, you have a moral conscience, just like any other human. But let's break down what this moral conscience is likely to look like, because you cannot allow opposition to just completely disregard this by saying it's an act or motion when it is literally a philosophy motion. Like the debate is probably centered around characterizing the moral conscience of this individual. To that extent, we tell you 2 things. Firstly, journalists are extremely compassionate, especially political ones, because their entire job is to tell stories of people who have gone through traumatic experiences and important experiences that are like ingrained in our history. That does not necessarily mean that they can only be compassionate to victims or that they can only be compassionate to people who are coerced into positions of oppression, but it means that they have the capacity to do that for both. But secondly, journalists have a purpose. They want to use their pen to make the world a better place. They want to get rid of corruption that causes suffering to people. They want to bring light to oppression that is the source of pain and famine and martyrdom. The ubiquitous feature of these journalists and their purposes is that they care about utility. They care about reducing suffering and reducing pain and reducing injustices. The winner of this debate will therefore be the one who explains how the journalist fulfills these incentives the best, those being achieving fame and a platform, as well as catering to their own moral conscience. So I'll begin by talking about the moral conscience. Firstly, who are you going to be more compassionate to? Because what opposition says is that this is going to be the family of the victims. We agree with this. We never object this. We never object that you're going to be compassionate to the families of the victims. The problem is opposition needed to prove why this journalist's compassion for the victims is going to lead them to want retributive justice to be enacted upon the war criminal. The closest thing we get to analysis for this is, the journalist might not be liberal, so you can be sure that they're going to prefer rehabilitation. That was never our argument. We never said the journalist was going to be liberal. What did we actually tell you? We told you that just as the journalist uncovered the family's experiences in this hunt, as per the info slide literally suggests, you also uncovered the war criminal's experience. You understand that they were coerced. You understand that they are trying to atone. You understand that the past is in the past, and punishing this criminal now isn't going to undo anything. What this means is that you see the story in this person, and that journalists especially have the capacity to understand this. I want to call upon a particularly powerful example, the famous article of My Family's Slave by The Atlantic, in which the journalist depicted the story of a person who grew up in a household who owned a slave, and he was not able to really understand how morally reprehensible it was for him to own that slave because of the context of the time he was living in, and the retrospective story of him understanding how he was so able to live in that reality because of the ignorance and because of the societal pressures that were on him was extremely compelling. So you can just translate that to the story of this war criminal that you're going to find. You can translate that to his story of being coerced, his story of understanding his sins, his story of trying to atone for them in this small community. Now, what this means is that you feel compassion for both the criminal and the victims. It would be extremely uncharitable for opposition to say that this is not true, given that the entire info slide reveals that you as a journalist acknowledge that they're trying to do something better and they're trying to improve as a person, not right now. This means then that the journalist is going to refer to their bottom line for morality rather than trying to push retributive justice on either the victims or either on the war criminal. And that bottom line is how to mitigate suffering and injustice. So how do we do that best? Firstly, this criminal's death isn't going to do anything because this undoes nothing. It doesn't bring anyone back to life. It doesn't undo any of the atrocities that were done. It just makes somebody lose a life. But also, I just want to give some responses because opposition under this claim says that, oh, what about unmarked graves and how we find those? First of all, why would this person know where the unmarked graves of like random ass victims are? I'm really unsure why that is the case. Were they like guaranteed to be the head of like burials? That doesn't make sense. But even then, why would the families feel any better because of this? Are they going to go to the graves and dig them up to see if it was their family members? Are they going to go to some random cemetery and say, hey, there is a small chance that my dead ancestor is here, so I feel suddenly better about this? No, it doesn't actually do anything for the victims, and it doesn't do anything for the war criminal either. You don't make the world a better place at all, so I'm unsure why the journalist is going to want this. I'll take you later. But secondly, we tell you that the community is going to be harmed because the criminal will be lost and he is helpful to this community. Their response to this is, oh, he is old and he is replaceable. But this response is extremely emotionally naive because he probably has relationships with people that depend on him and that love him and that care about him. And you're going to be taking that away from these people. Then they try to counter this by saying, listen, but at least we're going to bring tourism to this isolated community and inject into their economy. First of all, where people really fly to this place if there's nothing to see and if there's no one to talk to and there's nothing to look at? Because first of all, this is extremely desolate and isolated as they agree. But also, there's no site to look at. There's no monument here. There's no museum here that covers the life of this like random war criminal that lived here. And even if that was the case, that is, if anything, a poor thing. Because even in their best case, that people do come to this community, all that's going to happen is this community is going to get gentrified and it is going to get demonized. Because now they're going to be known as the people who welcomed the war criminal. And corporations from around the world are going to start building hotels and start putting the locals out of job to cater to these tourists, just to look at some small shack where this war criminal stayed out. I'll take that POI.
Why do people go to Anne Frank's house?
Whoa, I just choked on water. Can you repeat that? Can you repeat that?
Yeah, why do people go to Anne Frank's house?
People go to Anne Frank's house because they want to see that victim. But the thing is, Anne Frank's house is in Germany where there's lots of other places to see. People aren't going to go fly to the middle of Guatemala to see this war criminal. So sorry about that. Oh my God. Okay, secondly, fame as a journalist. I paused my timer, by the way. Opposition tells you that your incentive as a journalist to get famous, and this is going to be a big story, this is going to be fulfilled. I just want to say that firstly, this isn't necessarily a career-making story, because if this motion was about uncovering the iconic demagogue leader of evil forces in the past, like Hitler or Mussolini or Hirohito, then the motion would have clarified that. This is probably a smaller actor in the war that is still recognizable to those well-versed in its history, like a captain or a general or a media lead or something. So to that extent, people just aren't going to care about this because this war was a long time ago. And most people who aren't very old didn't experience or understand the horrors of this war directly. But most importantly, people are concerned with news of celebrity scandals and economic and current tensions. We are in a 24/7 news cycle where there are more important things happening that are more proximate to these people all of the time over the story of some random war criminal being uncovered from 40 years ago. Maybe the story will make headlines for a couple of weeks, but after that, no one will care that much, and therefore they will not care about you. And we already gave you so much analysis about how your publisher is going to take the spotlight instead because your publisher is greedy. But also, people rarely consider the journalist when they read anyways. And journalists don't get famous from a single viral story. It is through consistent, interesting, and compelling stories that are often from personal experiences. What this means is that UP actually does not get fame at all. They only get a 15-minute spotlight at best. You will have to weigh that against the moral concessions that they have to make as journalists. For that reason, I don't know what time I'm at. So proud to propose.
Thank you, Proposition 3, for that fine speech. To conclude the constructive part of the case from the opposition bench, may we please have Opposition 3.
Hi, am I audible and visible?
Yes, you're both audible and visible.
Great. Signing in 3, 2, 1. Not a single Nazi had to operate the gas chambers. Not a single Afghani general had to shoot and kill civilians in a village. But you know who did have no choice? The son of a Jewish parent killed by the Nazis. The mother of an Afghani child who was murdered by terrorist militants. World War II was under a lifetime ago, panel. Don't let proposition characterize otherwise. What do we think proposition does? In this entire debate, they've characterized this war criminal as a poor, starving, desperate, coerced soldier in the Great Depression who suffered and therefore had to murder civilians. We think that borders on abhorrent. 3 questions in this debate. First, then on characterization, second on moral impetus, and finally on the personal incentives for the journalist in terms of fame. First, then I want to go into characterization, because I sincerely cannot believe that this is a debate where a proposition attempts to clarify what a war criminal is and ends up on the side of being coerced and being essentially a lowly random person. Because I want to discuss what they actually told about. They told us from first and down the line that this is a soldier who was oppressed under a corrupt regime, who was starving, who somehow went through the Great Depression and also at the same time was a Nazi in World War II. Their timeline is so inconsistent, but more importantly, borders on a complete random ideas. We think it is absolutely terrible as a characterization. 3 responses. The first is to say that there is simply no mechanization whatsoever onto their world. I don't see a single actual reason why this person is coerced, as opposed to the analysis that some people were coerced. And whilst it is true that some German soldiers were coerced into being German soldiers and were coerced into being Nazis due to patriotism, there is a significant difference between being a soldier who murdered other soldiers on the battlefield and being a soldier who was stationed at Auschwitz and actively involved in the gassing of Jewish civilians.
Yo, why?
We think the difference is extremely significant. They've never engaged with that throughout. But secondly, they say that the soldiers existed and they were different, and that in this circumstance, it would be more likely to be the coerced one. If that is true, we don't see why the process of due process can't extrapolate that. For instance, we say down the line, the fact that they are likely to be executed despite this means that they are likely to be a significant war criminal. We point to instances such as the Nuremberg trials, where there was a distinction between the punishment that the final leader of Germany got and a random gas chamber operator. Whilst one may have received prison, the other received execution, we think that there's a significant difference. And finally, there's no actual response to the clear reasons we gave you, namely, firstly, the notoriety in terms of being long forgotten. Second, the criminal process, finding out the degree to which this person is a significant war criminal. And finally, the nature of war crimes itself. That means it is more likely on balance that this war criminal is a significant person. We think that based on the motion in the info slide, and also just based on common sense about who you would remember and therefore forget and now discover again, we think it's likely that this war criminal has at least killed civilians by their own accord. We don't think it is a fair characterization for Prop to say this is a random soldier that is completely out of the debate. But more importantly, look, the Nuremberg trials didn't prosecute everyone, and the lack of actual reasons to why this is a random person brings down all of Proposition case. Because if I were to boil it down, I would say their case essentially, this guy wasn't that bad, he's repenting now, and now this random community has Wi-Fi and all is forgiven. Because of that characterization, we think they instantly lose this debate. But before I go into why in terms of moral impetus, I want to touch on how the victim characterization has also been insidiously portrayed by Proposition. Because all we hear down the line is that victims have moved on and they don't care. They won't want to visit a random grave because, I mean, who even cares about the victims of war crimes, right? 3 responses. Firstly, no, that is not true. People visit Anne Frank's house because of the experiences she had and how that resonates to their own Jewish upbringing. Because they know that their grandparents were persecuted and entire lineages were wiped out. Because they, as an Afghani mother, know the villages that were slaughtered and massacred just a few blocks down from where they are. We think that those are extremely strong moral pressures on victims who care down the line. But second, if they don't care, we gave you a second that the criminal justice system will simply take that into account. The first thing we told you is that it allowed different degrees of punishment that allow for these differences, and that is fine. But as an extension to this, there is also the benefits of the criminal justice system itself. That looks like things like victim impact and having closure for these victims in terms of being able to confront their oppressor. We don't think that is a fair characterization here either for them to simply claim that World War II was so long ago, who even cares? World War II was a lifetime ago, I remind you. War criminals and Nazis are still being prosecuted today. It's absolutely not a closed case. What this all means is that characterization from Prop and the only thing their case relies on, this trade-off between utility, falls apart. This is a significant war criminal to which bringing justice would bring significant utility to many, many people around the world. But second, though, let's go on the moral weight on the journalist, because this is not a decision, I remind you, that the journalist can unilaterally make, and it's not a decision that they would want to unilaterally make. Why is this? We gave you a first clear pathway as to how this journalist even discovers this war criminal in the first place. They're likely to have researched, they're likely to have followed a trail, and they're likely to have followed victim stories to discover this clue. They didn't walk into a bar in London, as we told you, and suddenly stumble upon this person that they recognize. They did significant research to these victims. They may have met with victims and advocacy groups and talked to them for their experiences. What that means is we gave you at first that they have an emotional connection to these individuals and their stories. The only response we hear from proposition is that you can also film a connection to soldiers because you're impartial and unbiased, and that you understand that some soldiers have been coerced. First response: yes, they're impartial and they try to be impartial, but that doesn't mean that if you hear about harrowing stories about mass slaughter, you don't have an instinctive reaction that this is absolutely terrible and you prioritize that first. It is why you prioritize things that are most proximate to you, i.e. the thing that you've researched the most and know the most about, as opposed to this vague idea that maybe the soldier was coerced. But secondly, that characterization also relies on the initial prioritization that the soldier was coerced, which we simply don't think is accurate whatsoever. We think that in the trade-off between the tangible deaths and mass graves that we talk about, and the fact that civilians have been killed and war crimes have occurred, you as a journalist face a significant moral pressure to prioritize that emotional connection over vague things. What that means is we gave you down the line that this will burden you as a journalist for life. You are always with the understanding that you have made a decision that means that these victims will never receive justice and that you unilaterally made this decision. The only response we get from proposition is inherently mitigatory when they tell us two things. The first is that they mitigate again with the characterization and say that you also prioritize these small communities. I'll go into later why that doesn't matter. But even on this mitigatory stance, the fact is the journalist is still making a decision based on their moral principles, which means that they understand that they're making a decision for this entire broad community. We think that any journalist with any sort of moral weight would understand that that is not their decision to make, that is a decision of victims and victim advocacy groups to make. But second, their reduction of moral focus is based on the community. They say that the community is living now, the soldier is living now, and therefore that bears more moral weight. Three things. The first is that we reject the premise that you could possibly weigh the community benefits higher. We told you at first and second, the things that this person is likely to do, like giving Wi-Fi or giving democracy or prosperity or introducing an outside world, are all good things for this small isolated community, which is, as both teams agree, where you probably live. But note that these things are not necessarily huge scale benefits, right? Even on the utility framework, you're unlikely to affect a large number of people. We think that in the trade-off between giving a small group of people Wi-Fi that can persist after this a war criminal was captured anyway, you prioritize the actual victims. But secondly, even if you get this utility, how much? Because the bigger group, that is all these victims, are likely to be more significant for you as a journalist. And finally, this is a personal decision that you have to make. You have to understand that even if there's objective utility in this community, there's this personal burden that you'll bear for the entire rest of your life if you harbor essentially a war criminal. But finally then, I want to go into personal recognition, because I think it's a strategic mistake for proposition's argument down the line on this to essentially be non-existent, right? The closest that we get to an actual reason why you wouldn't get this personal recognition is things like people don't care and copycats will exist. On people don't care, that is just downright false, and I've dealt with that through the last 2 points. But on copycats, you still have the initial work being created. You still have your recognition in academic articles as from reputable sources, maybe the Pulitzer Prize for journalism, that you were the person who discovered these individuals. You have the family and emotional validation that you get that we told you about first that was never touched on. It means that beyond the fact that you get fame and notoriety for the significant discovery, you get a clear moral conscience. No journalist would ever pick to harbor a war criminal, stand with the side opposition.
Thank you, Opposition 3, for that speech. Now, to conclude the opposition case as a whole, may we please have the reply speaker from the opposition bench.
I find the proposition case quite insulting because so far their strategy has been largely very baffling, because a lot of it has very little to do with what the journalist actually wants and just giving characterizations of what this war criminal has been at the time. That he was not Hitler, but instead he was Nazi soldier from battalion Phantom Tax 420 with registration number #252. He was coerced into it. He didn't do a lot of things. One, then he's not a classified war criminal. Number two, then he won't be immediately executed. Number 3, don't care. He's still a murderer who has wronged people. I agree with proposition that this guy has a moral conscience, which is why he will feel insurmountable guilt as a result of this. But even if it is completely uncertain what the societal reaction is to this, we gave 2 reasons why he has to err on the side of caution and prioritize revealing the truth rather than concealing it. 1, because we have given to you frameworks where we prioritize justice even if it happened a long time ago. There's a reason we still demand reparations for slavery. There's a reason we still demand reparations for the way that comfort women were mistreated during World War II. So even if it's a long time ago, society has decided that we want to execute this guy, and they've already mentioned that this is we want to place some moral weightage on these things. But number 2, you still err on the side of caution because it aligns with your journalistic principles of revealing the truth. Whatever happens afterwards may be out of your hands, but at the very least, you weren't complicit in concealing that truth. 2 issues. First, guilt and integrity. Second, personal recognition. First, guilt and integrity. Yes, on both sides, you feel some guilt, but debates are about scales and comparatives. You would feel some guilt if this criminal was executed, but you would feel far more guilt by keeping this secret from the families you promised you would find justice for. When you have to come back to the journalist headquarters and say, no, I never ended up finding him, but the truth will always loom over your shoulders. But 2, aside from the emotional guilt of this, there are other very professional and personal reasons for why you are invested in this particular discovery, and you will want to err on the side of revealing it. 1, you are a journalist. You are contracted and paid to find these things, and thus it aligns with what you've committed yourself to doing. 2, you interact with other journalists who uphold values of journalistic integrity. But thirdly, if you're someone who just stumbles upon this evidence, this probably means you've been working on the case for a long period of time that's led you towards discovering this indisputable evidence of a long thought to be dead war criminal that no one has been able to do for so long. So it probably suggests that you have some level of investment into this, you commit to this, and therefore not revealing it is a massive moral weight you have to carry around. I don't know why this is something that they've never engaged with. Second issue, on personal recognition. So we explain why revealing the secret would be good for you. And their only response to this is, if you maintain a sneaky link with the guy, it means you can also get new info and you can generate content for many weeks. The first thing is that if you maintain a sneaky link, he won't give you any info because he knows that he's going to be outed. And there's no reason for him to initiate this process with you because he knows that you are never going to out him. Rather, on our side, where we can get the guy to expose all of these things once we want to punish him. But number 2, the secret info you get from the sneaky link isn't very valuable because, as they say, it's not sensationalized. So we need to expose the guy for the info to even be of value because you get the virality. So what else did we explain? 1, you get career advancement. You are consulted as the expert on the secret island. 2, you get a range of other external benefits. So in the movie The Social Network, where the person is so impressed that she hooked up with Sean Parker because he founded Napster. So being the guy who brought justice to Hitler is not a bad way to get some gyat. Okay, honestly, if there was an award for the laziest mitigation ever, this team definitely wins that. Because they're like, well, publishers will claim credit because other people will also come and copy your work. They'll just double publish the article. Like 5 minutes of fame is still better than 0 minutes of fame. This is just ludicrous to me. At the end of the day, we prove why personally, professionally, and emotionally, this is good for you. This is my 4th and final APWSDC. Let's bring it home. I'm very proud to oppose.
Thank you, opposition reply, for that fine speech. Now to conclude the debate as a whole, may we please have proposition's reply speaker.
I think side opposition literally just conceded in their last speech what they spent over 30 minutes fighting about. 5 minutes of fame. That was all the impact they could claim at the end of the round because that was their impact. 5 minutes of fame, because at the end of the day, no one cares about a single article that you're going to write when there's 5 dozen other copycats out there, when you're just going to be distracted on your phone and watching YouTube videos all day. I don't think they can claim as much of an impact as they set out to be. On the comparative, I think we actually offer you a legitimate principle and a legitimate impact on this journalist career, which they still haven't dealt with throughout all their speeches. Firstly, on the principle, what's their solution? Their solution is to leave it to the justice system. Unfortunately, the justice system is not a perfect system. It's often just based on precedent and interpretations of highly conservative judges that are basically there for life, right? And it doesn't matter what society has decided. I think everyone here has disagreed with, society at some point in their lives. This is an actor motion. It's about what the journalist wants to do, how the journalist sees fit in this situation. And what we told you was that this was completely unprincipled, that there is no moral victory in killing someone who was indoctrinated and acting out of necessity. And let me be very clear. The Great Depression and propaganda wasn't some sort of, unlikely chance, as said opposition would like to characterize. It was 100% real for millions of people, and they cannot just discount that. This man has repented for his mistakes. We agree the Holocaust was an atrocity, but the solution isn't to kill an old man. That's not going to make, the victims of the families you promised to make better, like more happy, right? I think this is someone who has completely repented and changed their mind. This is someone who has spent his entire life doing moral goods, tried to do everything he could to make up for a crime that he was forced to commit. Is there anyone that's as morally innocent as that? I don't think so. So at the end of the day, I think what you see here is that we shouldn't be killing this man who clearly is different from his past, someone who, probably isn't supposed to be held responsible for his crime in the first place, simply due to the massive amounts of pressure on him to commit that crime in the first place. Because if me or you were in that same position, we likely also would have committed those war crimes as well. So we think it's incredibly unfair. As a journalist, this is unprincipled for you to do. All right, let me just give a reality check about their practical argument. We forget about the most newsworthy articles in less than 5 minutes. Russia and Ukraine, the newest, celebrity tour, right? There's so many distractions out there. Let's be charitable. Even in their best case scenario, let's say this was some high-ranking general, right? Do you know the name of any high-ranking general from World War II? Literally no one cares. This one article isn't going to make the difference, especially given the myriad of reasons and mitigation that we've given you already. What did matter was the unresponded to argument about insider information, because rather than blow up this guy for one forgettable article, we told you that this guy was a valuable source, a chance to explore your passions. Just think about it. This is an incredibly rare opportunity for you as a journalist. How many journalists are able to come up to someone who has actually experienced a past conflict, someone who has actually been there at that present time? This is a rare opportunity for you to explore your passions. This person can give you new ideas for a stream of articles for the next few years that will likely sustain your career. You can find out the truth, as side opposition likes so much, from a direct source. And that was what we offered to you on our side of the house. Not some 1 5-minute article, but a chance to explore your passions, to actually find out the history that you've been studying in college for 4 years, right? I think this is an incredibly valuable experience that you as a journalist do not want to miss out on. So because we are principally correct, because this is the best way to discover the truth, we're incredibly proud to propose.
Thank you, proposition reply. And I thank both the teams for what was an excellent round of debate. You will get to know the decision shortly. Meanwhile, I would request all the judges in the room to move to a breakout room. I think room 1 would be good for deliberation.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, judges.
Great debate, guys.
Everyone, thanks for judging.
Good job, guys.